Harold Thompson had always been a man of few words, but the ones he spoke carried weight. Now, lying motionless in a narrow hospice bed, surrounded by pale blue walls and the faint scent of antiseptic, he had almost nothing left to say. Time had become fragile, slipping away like sand through his fingers. Machines hummed softly around him, a rhythm he barely noticed anymore. The nurses came and went with gentle smiles and whispered voices, always kind but always moving like life itself onward, without pause. Outside his window, the world continued. Birds fluttered from branch to branch, the leaves trembled in the early autumn breeze, and people below walked briskly to their destinations, unaware of the quiet goodbye unfolding just one floor above. At 78, Harold had lived a full life. He had been a schoolteacher, a husband, a father, and a friend to many. But those titles now felt distant, like they belonged to someone else in another chapter of time. His wife Marianne had passed away 8 years earlier, and his only daughter lived several states away, unable to visit until the weekend. In these final days, what Harold missed most wasn't his house, or his books, or even his favorite armchair. It was Bentley. Bentley was not just a dog, he was the last living piece of Harold's heart, a golden retriever with soft amber eyes and a loyalty unmatched. Bentley had been by Harold's side for more than a decade. The two had built a quiet life together after Marianne's passing. Where Harold went, Bentley followed. They would take long walks through the park, sit for hours on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, and fall asleep to the sound of an old radio playing classical music. In every sense, Bentley filled the space that grief had left behind. Now, all Harold had of him was a framed photo beside the hospital bed. It showed Bentley with his head tilted to one side, ears perked, and tongue slightly out, forever curious, forever present. A soft knock interrupted the stillness. Nurse Ellen entered the room, her footsteps light, carrying a small tray with his evening medication. She was in her 30s, always calm, always composed. But today, she hesitated a little longer than usual. She looked at Harold with concern, then glanced at the untouched lunch tray still sitting on the side. "You haven't eaten anything today," she said softly, setting the tray down. "Not even your favorite mashed potatoes and gravy." Harold didn't respond at first. His eyes were fixed on the photo of Bentley. Finally, his lips moved just barely. "Don't have an appetite anymore," he said, his voice faint, like it was borrowed from someone else. Ellen pulled the chair closer. "Would you like me to call your daughter again?" He shook his head slowly. "She's coming. She said Saturday. It's okay." There was a pause. Then, almost as if the words had been waiting for permission to escape, he said, I want to see my dog one more time before I go." Ellen blinked, caught off guard by the request. In all her years as a nurse, she'd seen patients ask for strange things: a sip of old whiskey, a favorite song played on repeat, even a late night hamburger smuggled in past visiting hours. But this felt different. It was quiet, but not small. It was simple, but not ordinary. "I'll see what I can do," she said gently, giving his hand a light squeeze. Harold smiled, barely. "Thank you." When Ellen left the room, something in her chest tightened. She had grown used to the inevitable goodbyes in this job, but some of them stayed with you. Some of them made you question the rules, push the boundaries, and search for ways to honor not just the body, but the soul. Back in the room, Harold drifted into sleep. The photo of Bentley remained beside him, a silent witness to a bond stronger than time, illness, or even death. In that quiet room full of fading life, there was still one bright thread of hope, a tail-wagging memory, waiting just beyond the door. Before Harold Thompson's world became small, shrunk to the size of a hospice bed and the four corners of a quiet room, his days had been filled with purpose, routine, and a very specific kind of comfort, the kind only a dog can give. He had adopted Bentley 12 years earlier. At the time, Harold wasn't looking for a pet. His wife, Marianne, had passed just 6 months before, and the silence in the house had started to feel heavier than grief itself. He didn't sleep much. Meals were half-eaten, days blurred together. But then, one afternoon, as he walked past the community shelter out of sheer boredom, he heard a soft bark. It wasn't loud or demanding, just enough to make him stop. Behind the glass window sat a golden retriever puppy with large, patient eyes and a tail that wagged slowly, like a wave greeting the shore. He hadn't planned to bring the dog home. In fact, he told himself he was just going in to ask questions. But 20 minutes later, Bentley was curled up in the passenger seat of Harold's car, sound asleep, as if he had always belonged there. From that day forward, Bentley became Harold's closest companion. He wasn't just company, he was connection. They had a rhythm. Morning walks at 7 a.m., rain or shine. A game of fetch in the backyard before lunch. Evening tea on the porch, Harold sipping from a blue ceramic mug, while Bentley rested his chin on Harold's slippered foot. They shared everything. Quiet mornings, long drives with no destination. Even holiday dinners with Harold saving the last bite of turkey for Bentley. Over time, neighbors began to notice the pair. There they go again, someone would say as Harold and Bentley strolled down Maple Street. Children would run up to pet Bentley, and he'd patiently allow it, always gentle. Harold never had to use a leash. Bentley followed, always a step behind. Like a silent protector, their bond was unshakable, one built not on commands or training, but on quiet trust. Bentley knew when Harold was sad, and would rest his head on his lap. He sensed when Harold wasn't feeling well, and would stay close, watching carefully. As Harold aged, Bentley seemed to slow down too, as if keeping pace out of loyalty. After Harold fell ill earlier that year, everything changed quickly. What started as fatigue turned into hospital visits. The doctors said it was serious. Harold never spoke the word out loud. He didn't have to. He simply made arrangements, willed the house to his daughter, handed his keys to his neighbor, and asked just one favor from Mrs. Langley next door. Take care of Bentley if I can't. Mrs. Langley had kept her promise. She fed him, walked him, even brought him over to sit on Harold's porch, sometimes when he was still strong enough to visit home for a few hours. But when Harold was moved into full-time hospice care, the visits stopped. Hospital policy didn't allow animals inside. Rules were rules, they said. And Harold, being the kind of man who never made trouble, didn't push. But now, lying in that quiet room with fading strength, Harold's heart ached in ways no doctor could fix. He didn't fear the end. He had made peace with that. What unsettled him was the thought of leaving without saying goodbye to the one soul who had never left his side. Bentley didn't know about illness or hospitals or the finality of time. All he knew was that Harold had disappeared. For weeks, now, he had waited by the door after every walk, looking up expectantly. At night, he often sat in front of Harold's armchair, tail still, gaze fixed, as if waiting for a familiar hand to reach down and ruffle his ears. Back at the hospice, Nurse Ellen had taken Harold's request seriously, more seriously than even she expected. That night, she looked up the name Langley in the emergency contact file. She made the call. And when she heard the sound of Bentley's soft bark in the background, something in her heart tightened. Mrs. Langley, she said, voice low, but firm. I think it's time we make something beautiful happen. Would you like to continue with part 3, the quiet wish that moved hearts in the same detailed and emotional style? Nurse Ellen had worked in hospice care for nearly a decade, but Harold's request hit her differently. Maybe it was the stillness in his voice, or the way his hand had rested on the photograph of Bentley, like it was the only thing grounding him. It wasn't just a dying man's whim, it was a plea from the heart. That night, after her shift ended, Ellen didn't head home. Instead, she walked into the quiet administrative office and sat down across from the hospice director, Mr. Caldwell. He was a by-the-book kind of man, professional, kind, but often firm about rules. Ellen knew what she was about to suggest wouldn't be easy. I need 5 minutes, she said, folding her hands in front of her. It's about Mr. Thompson. Mr. Caldwell looked up from his screen. Is he in pain? No, Ellen replied softly. He asked to see his dog. Just once. Before she let the sentence trail off. The silence that followed said the rest. The director leaned back in his chair and sighed. You know the policy, Ellen. No animals inside the facility. It's for patient safety, Ellen nodded. I know. But this isn't just any patient, and it's not just any request. Harold isn't asking for a second chance or a miracle. He just wants to say goodbye to the one soul that's been with him through everything. He doesn't have much time left. There was another long pause. Mr. Caldwell rubbed the bridge of his nose. It sets a precedent, he murmured. Ellen didn't back down. Then let it set one we're proud of. Something in her tone, quiet but unwavering, made him stop and look at her. We'd have to sanitize. Schedule the visit after hours. Limit exposure. I'll take care of everything, Ellen said quickly. I've already spoken to his neighbor, Mrs. Langley. She's caring for the dog. She's more than willing to bring him. Bentley is calm, clean, well-behaved. We'll keep it short and controlled. Mr. Caldwell glanced at the clock. He sighed again, longer this time, and finally said, Okay, one visit. No one else around. Tomorrow night. Ellen smiled, not out of victory, but out of relief. Thank you, he'll never forget this. None of us will. The next morning, Harold woke to the gentle rustling of curtains and soft morning light filtering in. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, he seemed surprised to still be there. You've got a special visitor coming, Ellen whispered as she adjusted his blanket. Tomorrow evening. Harold's lips parted slightly. Bentley. Ellen nodded. He's coming to see you. Just the two of you. One more time. Tears welled in Harold's tired eyes, but he didn't speak. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward the photo on the table, then closed his eyes with a look of quiet peace. Back at home, Mrs. Langley was preparing Bentley. She brushed his fur, clipped his nails, and even gave him a quick rinse in the backyard. Bentley didn't understand the fuss, but he was calm, sensing something unusual. That evening, she laid out his leash and spoke softly to him as if he were human. We're going to see him. Sweetheart, she said. Your best friend's been waiting. The next day, the hospice staff whispered about the plan like it was a secret too precious to say out loud. The housekeeping team cleaned the hallway twice. A blanket was placed over Harold's bed, freshly laundered. A soft mat was laid by his bedside in case Bentley wanted to lie down. Everything was ready. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky turned a dusky pink, a car pulled into the hospice's back lot. Out stepped Mrs. Langley with Bentley, who sniffed the air and perked up. It had been weeks since he'd seen Harold, but something about the evening felt familiar. Inside, Harold was awake, more alert than usual. Ellen stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. He's here, she said with a warm smile, just like you asked. For the first time in days, Harold's eyes lit up not with pain, not with resignation, but with life. The hospice center had never seen a moment like this. Bentley's paws made the faintest sound as he walked down the quiet corridor, guided gently by Mrs. Langley. The staff had dimmed the hallway lights, and each person they passed stepped aside with a respectful silence. Some nurses paused to watch, holding their breath, as if something sacred was unfolding. In front of them, a few had never even met Harold, but had heard about the man who asked for only one thing, a final moment with his dog. Bentley seemed to know exactly where to go. He walked with calm focus, tail swaying gently, his amber eyes scanning the doors, until he reached Harold's room. Mrs. Langley didn't need to pull his leash. Bentley stopped right outside the open door and waited inside. Harold was propped up slightly with extra pillows. His face, pale and lined with time, softened the instant his gaze found the golden fur at the doorway. His eyes, so dim these past days, suddenly glowed with life, the kind only love could awaken. Come here, boy, Harold said, his voice just above a whisper. Bentley didn't hesitate. He trotted in with quiet urgency, tail wagging slowly, and gently placed his front paws on the edge of the bed. Harold reached out with trembling hands and rested them on Bentley's head, fingers weaving into his soft fur. For a moment, neither of them moved. The clock ticked. The machines buzzed. But in that room, time stood still. Mrs. Langley stepped back quietly, tears already filling her eyes. She stood beside Nurse Ellen, who had returned for the evening just to witness the reunion. Both women watched in silence. I missed you, buddy, Harold whispered, his voice cracking. Missed you every day. Bentley rested his chin on Harold's chest, completely still, as if he understood that this wasn't just a visit, it was a goodbye. Harold chuckled softly, a fragile sound that made the room feel warmer. You look cleaner than I've ever seen you, he joked. You didn't like that bath, did you? Bentley responded with a soft sigh, and licked Harold's hand gently, his eyes never leaving his dot. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The love between the man and his dog filled every corner of the room. There was no need for words, no explanations, just the raw, quiet truth of what they shared. Down the hall, other staff members had gathered near the nurse's station, speaking in whispers. Some checked the cameras discreetly to witness the visit. Though the hospice had long-standing rules against animals for health and safety reasons, no one questioned the decision now. Everyone could feel that this was something different. Something right. This, one nurse whispered, is why we do what we do. Inside the room, Harold leaned his head against Bentley's. You've been such a good boy, he murmured. You stayed with me when no one else could. I'm so proud of you, so proud. Bentley didn't move. He stayed there, chest rising and falling softly, a warm anchor for the man who had once carried him. Home in his arms, Mrs. Langley quietly stepped forward and placed a small flannel blanket over Harold's legs. We brought his favorite, she whispered to Ellen. He used to nap with it on the couch. Ellen nodded. Let them have a little longer. The hospice director, Mr. Caldwell, peeked in from the hallway. He stood silently, hands folded, then turned away and walked down the corridor without saying a word. The policy had been bent, perhaps broken, but in that moment, no one doubted that it had been for the right reasons. As night fell outside, the world kept moving. Cars passed by, families gathered for dinner, and stars began to appear. But in that small room tucked in a corner of the hospice center, a man and his dog lay, side by side, hearts in sync, saying all the things that couldn't be said. And for once, a rule had been rewritten not by policy, but by compassion. Bentley shifted gently on the bed, curling closer to Harold without disturbing the fragile tangle of tubes and wires beside him. The machines hummed steadily in the background, but for once, they didn't matter. What mattered was the warmth beneath Harold's hand, and the way his fingers stayed resting gently between Bentley's ear-soft strokes. Slow and steady, as if his body remembered how to say goodbye even when his voice struggled. Harold had always been a quiet man, not shy, just thoughtful, someone who spoke when something needed to be said, and stayed silent when it didn't. But in that moment, he found himself whispering to Bentley, as if the dog were the only soul who could truly hear him. "You remember our first walk," he said, the words barely a breath. "You chased that squirrel down the street and nearly dragged me with you. I had to apologize to Mrs. Jenkins for knocking over her trash bins." Bentley responded with a low, contented grunt and adjusted his position, as if confirming the memory. "I never thought I'd have another companion after your mum passed," Harold continued, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "But you filled every quiet space, made the silence softer." There was something remarkable about the way Bentley stayed still. No fidgeting, no restlessness, just presence. As if he understood exactly what was happening and had chosen to offer all he had, his comfort, his loyalty, his love in that one fleeting window of time. The hallway outside Harold's room remained respectfully quiet. A few nurses passed by slowly, peeking in through the door left slightly ajar. One of them, Julia, the hospice's youngest staff member, paused for longer than most. She wiped her eyes quickly with her sleeve, then moved on. Moments like this stayed with people. Back in the room, Harold turned his head toward the window, where the sun had just finished setting. The golden hour had passed, casting the sky in deep indigo. The stars had begun to peek through the clouds, faint and flickering. "Marianne always said the stars were just holes in heaven's floor," he whispered, letting the light shine through. "You think she's looking down at us right now?" Bentley let out a slow exhale, his breath warm against Harold's chest. "I hope she's proud," Harold added softly. "I didn't get everything right, but I tried to love right. That's what she always said mattered most." Nurse Ellen stood just outside the door, listening. She didn't intrude. This was Harold's moment and Bentley's, but her eyes burned with quiet tears. It wasn't just the reunion itself. It was the honesty in the room, the raw, unspoken connection that didn't need translation. A man saying goodbye, not just to life, but to the very heart that had walked beside him. Through it, Mrs. Langley stepped in quietly with a thermos of tea and set it on the bedside table. She didn't speak either. She simply walked over to Bentley and placed a hand gently on his back. "You're doing great, boy," she whispered. Bentley didn't move. His ears twitched slightly, but his gaze stayed on Harold. Suddenly, Harold smiled, a soft, tired smile that made the lines on his face seem almost peaceful. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me after Marianne," he said, stroking Bentley's fur with the last bit of strength in his fingers. "Thank you for staying." Tears silently streamed down Mrs. Langley's face, and Ellen finally stepped inside. She placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "Would you like a few more minutes?" she asked quietly. Harold blinked slowly. "Please." And so they gave him time. Another hour passed. Bentley remained beside him, not moving, not sleeping, just there, fully and completely there. The kind of presence that didn't ask questions or offer solutions. It just stayed. When Ellen returned later to check on him, Harold had dozed off. His breathing was slower now, each rise and fall of his chest a little shallower, but his hand was still on Bentley's back. Palm to paw, man to dog, friend to friend, and in that small, sacred space between life and letting go, the two souls remained together, peaceful, unshaken, and whole. The hours drifted by like quiet waves, slow and steady. The world outside Harold's window had turned dark, but the room itself glowed with a gentle, golden hush. The bedside lamp cast a soft light on Harold's face, revealing a calmness that hadn't been there for weeks. Bentley hadn't moved. His body was curled beside Harold, head resting near his hand, eyes still and steady. Every few minutes, he would raise his nose slightly and press it into Harold's palm, a silent check-in as if to say, "I'm here, I'm not leaving." There was no barking, no whining, no attempts to explore or distract. Bentley, the same dog who once tugged Harold down city sidewalks chasing pigeons, now lay completely still. It was as though he understood every unspoken truth. No words were needed between them. Love had its own language. Harold stirred slightly, his breath catching as he opened his eyes again. He looked down and smiled when he saw Bentley still there. "Stubborn," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "Just like me." He reached out again, brushing his fingers through Bentley's fur. The texture was familiar, comforting like an old sweater, worn so often it had become a second skin. Each stroke was slower than the last, but deliberate. It wasn't just affection, it was remembrance. He didn't say much after that. He didn't have to. Everything that mattered had already been said. Dor felt in the silence between them. Nurse Ellen sat quietly in the corner, keeping watch from a respectful distance. She had witnessed many end-of-life moments over the years, but this one was different. This wasn't just about a man dying peacefully. It was about a connection that didn't fade with age or illness. A bond that didn't need sound to be understood. Occasionally, Ellen would wipe her eyes with the cuff of her sleeve and glance down at her notebook. She had been writing down small details, partly to remember, partly to find meaning. Man, dog, no words, only love. She scribbled across the page, not sure whether she was documenting something or simply trying to hold on to it. A few minutes later, Mrs. Langley returned, holding a soft toy in her hand, Bentley's favorite, a worn-out stuffed duck with one wing missing. She knelt beside Bentley and held it out. "Look what I brought," she whispered, trying not to break the quiet. Bentley sniffed it, but didn't take his eyes off Harold. "He doesn't want the toy," Ellen said gently. "He just wants him." Mrs. Langley nodded, blinking fast as tears filled her eyes again. She set the toy on the edge of the bed and rested a hand on Bentley's back. Harold opened his eyes once more. He looked at her, then at Ellen. "Don't let him feel lost," he said, voice slow and cracked. "He doesn't know how to be alone." Ellen walked to the bed and placed her hand over his. "He won't be alone," she promised. "We'll make sure of it." Harold seemed satisfied with that. He closed his eyes, exhaled deeply, and allowed his head to rest against the pillow again. The room returned to quiet. No beeping, no talking, only the soft rhythm of two heartbeats. Side by side, one was fading, one was holding on. The minutes stretched gently. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed. Bentley blinked slowly but didn't move. There were no goodbyes in the traditional sense. No dramatic final words. No sudden silence that broke the room. Instead, what lingered was presence, a kind of wordless comfort that didn't need a voice to speak volumes. That was the way. Harold's hand stayed on Bentley until the very end. It was the way Bentley's ears twitched every time Harold's breath changed. Alert, listening, guarding. Was the kind of love that wasn't loud, but never quiet either. It was simply there. That night, long after visiting hours had ended and the rest of the world fell asleep, two souls remained wrapped in a sacred, shared peace. One human, one animal, and a connection that didn't need anything more than stillness to say everything. The room had fallen completely still. No sounds, no movement, just the quiet rhythm of slow, uneven breaths. Harold was resting now, his chest rising faintly beneath the soft hospital blanket. His hand remained against Bentley's fur, though his fingers had stopped stroking. His eyes were closed, and a faint, peaceful smile curved the corners of his lips. Nurse Ellen checked the monitors, but only for a moment. She knew. Anyone in the room could feel it, that unmistakable stillness that comes just before someone slips from one world to the next. It wasn't frightening or sudden. It felt natural, like a soft candle flickering low until it simply goes out. Bentley shifted slightly, but didn't lift his head. His body pressed even closer to Harold's, his eyes fixed on his friend's face as if still waiting for the next blink, the next breath, the next whispered word. Mrs. Langley stood quietly near the doorway, a tissue in her hand, her eyes shimmering with tears she didn't try to hide. She had known Harold for nearly 20 years. They weren't family, but he had been like an uncle to her children. She remembered the day Bentley came home, the way Harold smiled for the first time since his wife passed, holding the squirming puppy like a treasure. It had always been Harold and Bentley after that, side by side, through long winters, sunny, garden days, and quiet holidays. And now, Here they were, again side by side for the final moment. Then, slowly, Harold's breathing came to a stop. There was no alarm, no rush of doctors or flashing monitors. Just silence. And peace. Ellen stepped forward, placed 2 fingers gently on Harold's wrist, and waited. She bowed her head, then looked over at Mrs. Langley. "He's gone," she said softly, her voice breaking just slightly. But Bentley didn't need to be told. Almost as if he'd known it before anyone else. He rose slowly to his feet and let out a small, low whimper, not distressed, but mournful. He leaned in and rested his head gently on Harold's chest one last time, then sat back, gazing at the man who had been his whole world. It was the kind of goodbye that didn't need words. Bentley didn't bark or whine. He didn't pace or pull toward the door. He simply sat, quietly, as if paying his respects. Ellen knelt down beside him and placed a hand on his back. "He waited for you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He stayed, just for you." Bentley looked at her with soft eyes, then back at Harold, as if to say he understood. Maybe not in the way humans did, but in the way dogs always seem to understand things we can't explain. Mrs. Langley came forward and knelt on the other side of the bed. "Come on, sweetheart," she said gently, patting her leg. Bentley didn't move at first, but after a moment, he stepped down from the bed, walked over to her, and sat beside her feet. The room stayed still. No one rushed to remove things. No one turned off the machines just yet. There was a reverence to the moment, as if time itself was pausing to acknowledge that something beautiful had ended. Later that evening, after Harold's body was gently prepared and the room cleaned, Ellen placed the photo of Bentley back on the nightstand. Next to it, she left the flannel blanket they had shared during the visit. Still holding a trace of warmth, Bentley rode home with Mrs. Langley that night, curled in the back seat. He didn't bark during the drive. He simply stared out the window, quietly watching the dark shapes of trees pass by. When they reached her home, Bentley walked in and headed straight to Harold's favorite chair. He didn't jump up, he just sat next to it, waiting, watching. And though Harold was no longer there, Bentley still kept his silent vigil, guarding the memory of a man who had loved him with every part of his quiet, steady heart. The morning after Harold Thompson passed, the hospice center felt a little different. Quieter, yes, but also more connected, more human. Word had spread among staff, and even a few visiting families, about the dog who came to say goodbye. Nurses who hadn't even worked the evening shift paused at Harold's door that morning, now empty, and left flowers or notes. Ellen returned to work with puffy eyes, but a soft, thoughtful smile. She wasn't grieving like a family member, but something inside her had shifted. Harold's final hours had reminded her of what this job truly meant: honoring life in all its forms, right up to its last breath. She met with Mr. Caldwell later that afternoon. He sat behind his desk, flipping through his usual stack of paperwork. "I've been thinking," he said, before she could even speak, "about the visit." Ellen sat down slowly, unsure of what he would say next. He looked up. "We've spent years building structure and policy to protect our patients. That won't change. But sometimes, structure has to bend for the sake of the soul." Ellen's eyes softened. "So," he leaned back in his chair, "we're starting a pilot program. Controlled pet visits. With strict guidelines, of course, but open to patients who request it. What Harold experienced shouldn't be an exception. It should be a gift we can offer others too." Ellen nodded, unable to hold back the emotion rising in her throat. He'd be happy to know that. That week, the hospice created a small corner in their newsletter dedicated to Harold's story. It included a photo of Bentley sitting at Harold's bedside, and a quote. Harold once told Ellen, "Love doesn't need to speak, it just needs to stay." The story resonated deeply, not just with staff and patients, families, but with people beyond the center's walls. Soon, a local news station reached out to cover the story. Then, a regional newspaper published a feature. And before long, photos of Bentley and Harold had traveled across the country, shared thousands of times on social media. The comments poured in. "I'm sobbing. This is what love looks like. Every hospice should offer this. Dogs know. They always know." It didn't stop there. Donations came in, some from strangers earmarked for pet-friendly initiatives in elder care. Other hospice centers began reviewing their own policies, inspired by the story of a man who asked for only one final moment of love. As for Bentley, life slowly took on a new rhythm. He stayed with Mrs. Langley for a few more weeks, then was adopted by Harold's niece, Claire, who had driven down for the funeral. Claire had grown up visiting Harold every summer, and though she lived in a small home a few towns away, She welcomed Bentley with open arms. He's not just Harold's dog, she told Ellen during a visit. He's his legacy. Bentley adjusted gradually. He spent his days in Claire's sunlit backyard, snoozing beneath the trees and going on slow, peaceful walks. At night, he curled up on a soft cushion in the living room, surrounded by photos of Harold, including the one of the two of them on the porch, Bentley's head in Harold's lap, both of them watching the sky. Sometimes, Bentley would get up in the middle of the night and sit in front of Harold's old armchair, just like he used to. Claire never disturbed him. She'd watch quietly from the hallway, holding her breath. People came and went. Stories moved on, but that image of Bentley at Harold's bedside stayed in everyone's hearts. That it reminded them that love is not bound by years or species. It reminded them that sometimes the deepest goodbyes are not loud or dramatic, but quiet, loyal, and full of grace. Harold Thompson didn't ask for much in his final days. Just one more moment, one more look, one more soft brush of fur beneath his hand, and in getting that, he left behind a gift much greater than he ever imagined. Not just a memory, but a movement.